Well, I said that there was nothing wrong with you, but you are different. Shifting you out of from where you were, funneling your essence back into your body, it altered you on a basic molecular level. Probably just enough to confuse the sensors or whatever in Spike's chip. But it's all just surfacey physical stuff. It wouldn't have any more effect than a bad sunburn.
I didn't come back wrong.
No, you're the same Buffy, with a deep tropical cellular tan.
You must have missed something. Will you check again?
Buffy, I promise there's nothing wrong with you.
There has to be. This can't be me. It isn't me.
I am someone who is very much kept breathing by entertaining and compelling fiction. It is like my lifeblood. It is what my neurodivergent brain thrives on in order to keep itself from going insane. And just like any other young girl, or supposed girl, in the early 2000s, I grew up fully submerged in the Twilight frenzy. Even if you yourself were not a fan, you had most likely read at least one book, or you were well aware of the Twilight universe and its characters. You literally could not escape it. It was everywhere. And at 11 years old, I was an avid fan. It was my special interest throughout most of my preteen years, and I adored the series with like a blinding passion, the way I adore most things I become obsessed with. It is just quite simply autistic nature. Now, my mother was not happy. She thought that both the book series and the movies were romanticizing toxic and possessive behavior in romantic relationships and teaching the wrong lessons to young girls. Now, looking back, I realized that she was kind of right. That's not to say that there isn't any value in toxic stories or unstable and unhealthy relationships depicted in media, but a heavily romanticized YA outlook on a vampire love story that was being peddled to children was probably not the greatest approach, in my opinion. So my parents decided that the whole Twilight phase needed to stop, and I was introduced to a different kind of vampire media. Something similar enough to pique my interest, but with better characters and a more well-rounded depth, as well as an overall more powerful message. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, it's worth mentioning that I was watching the show from the ages of around 11 to 13 during the early to mid-2000s. And none of my friends or peers even knew what the show was, and all the people who watched and loved the show while it was still airing were now adults. So I didn't really have anyone to discuss the show with other than my parents. So all of my Buffy brain rot sort of circulated around inside my subconscious for a while until just recently, where I finally started posting about it on Tumblr and following Buffy blogs. I've also been noticing that, like, recently there's been this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Uprising probably isn't the right word, but like this increase in people my age discovering the show and becoming obsessed with it. And that's really interesting because I feel like most of the people that are like old, sort of like veteran Buffy fans are much older. So like I see these interactions between these two groups of people very much like Gen Z, using Gen Z language and memes and jokes surrounding the story and these things that are happening to these characters, versus like the older generation like looking on things with like an era of nostalgia and sort of comparing like how like sort of attitudes on certain topics definitely changed a lot compared to nowadays. It's interesting because I'm sort of in the middle of these discussions where I'm relatively young. I'm like around the same age as most of these people, you know, like in my 20s, but I'm an older Buffy fan in the sense that like I watched it a long time ago. Another thing to consider is that there were definitely some things on the show that I was too young for when I first saw it. Like the episode Seeing Red comes to mind, as well as The Body. If you are planning on showing Buffy to your kids one day, which I definitely think you should, you just need to be mindful about their age and their maturity level and thinking about like what they're really ready to see. And I think you need to be prepared to explain certain things to your children that might lead into some uncomfortable discussions, and you need to ask yourself if you're ready to have those discussions. Also, there was just like a bunch of metaphor and philosophy and different themes that completely just flew right over my head as a kid. But despite all of that, I fell completely in love right away, and it became my new special interest. It is actually still one of my special interests to this day. One of the fundamental differences between Twilight and Buffy is the way Buffy the Vampire Slayer essentially presents the argument between romanticism versus anti-romanticism. So romanticism refers to an artistic movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, which was heavily focused on imagination, aesthetics, and idealism over reason and practicality, intuition over facts. And romanticism can also refer to a state of mind that prioritizes these things. Anti-romanticism is the opposite. It is the exploration of the darker side of humanity, as well as uncompromising and unflinching criticisms of romantic illusions. It essentially makes the case for valuing pragmatism over idealism and reason over emotion. It can also be defined as rejecting or contradicting romantic ideals and aesthetics. Now, I wouldn't necessarily argue that Twilight defends romanticism. However, it is a heavily romanticized story, especially in New Moon, where Bella actually attempts suicide rather than live without Edward. And later on, he, believing that she is dead, nearly exposes himself as a vampire to the world, which he knows will get him killed by the Volturi, who are basically the vampires in charge of all vampires. At least that's what I remember. It's supposed to mirror Romeo and Juliet. But what I think Stephenie Meyer forgot, or at least conveniently overlooked in this case, is that Romeo and Juliet is supposed to be a tragedy. Whereas in New Moon, the narrative tries to sell all of this as like the peak of romance. Now, there are 2 seasons of Buffy that make a case for anti-romanticism. Season 2 and Season 6, which happens to be my favorite season, which is something that is kind of controversial in the Buffy fandom. In Season 2, the beginning of the season presents a heavily romanticized narrative of Buffy and Angel, very similar to Twilight, actually. We are told by the narrative and the comments of various characters, sometimes even Buffy and Angel themselves, that their relationship can't work, or it shouldn't. You know, like, he's a 200-year-old vampire, and she's the vampire slayer. Angel's immortal, and she isn't. It's doomed. It's a forbidden love. However, they keep orbiting each other, and from the way the writing is originally constructed, we are clearly supposed to be rooting for them. It's constructed as a classic tragic romance in some ways, just like Romeo and Juliet. But midway through Season 2, the romanticized fantasy is shattered when Angel loses his soul and becomes angelus. Now, this is when the narrative shifts to anti-romanticism. Buffy needs to start looking at things through a practical lens. As the Slayer, responsibility falls to her to make the hard choices and keep the world safe. She must be pragmatic and cannot afford to be swept up in her emotions in an idealized romance. More to the point, I believe the entirety of Season 2 isn't just warning the audiences of the dangers of romanticism, but the dangers of losing yourself in love, something that the show comments on later on in Season 3.
Lots of people lose themselves in love. It's no shame. They write songs about it. The hitch is, you can't stay lost. Sooner or later, you have to get back to yourself.
And if you can't?
If you can't, well, love becomes your master and you're just its dog.
A Tumblr blog called Implementation, I hope I pronounced that correctly, wrote, "In turn, Angel's devastating transformation is a metaphor for broader disillusionment about romantic ideas. When Angel loses his soul, the rose-colored glasses are lifted, so to speak, and Buffy is forced to see the situation for what it is. And then in the Season 2 finale, she is finally forced to kill him to save the world." This brings us to the second season of Buffy that is heavily tied to themes of anti-romanticism, Season 6. Season 6 is often labeled by some as Buffy the Vampire Slayer's worst season. Season 6 received a lot of backlash when it aired and still receives criticism today for being too dark and supposedly too depressing. I remember when I was younger and I was watching it for the first time, I felt the exact same way. You know, it essentially broke down to the fact that I was a child and I was being confronted with very dark and scary adult things that my young brain just wasn't ready to conceptualize. But then I got older and I started to deal with things such as depression, burnout, and unpacking childhood trauma. And I was starting to feel the effects of being autistic in a neurotypical world and masking for long periods of time. My life was getting dark. My mind was getting dark. And I was also coming to terms with my sexuality and figuring out ways of exploring that sexuality. All of this meant that I was coincidentally exactly where I needed to be to enjoy season 6. As good as the season is when examining it in a literal sense, season 6 is also greatly improved by taking the metaphorical implications of the season's plot into consideration. As you may or may not know, the 3 original main Scoobies, as they're called, all metaphorically represent a part of Buffy. Xander represents her heart, Giles her mind, and Willow her spirit. During the course of season 6, these things fail her. Giles, her mind, abandons her, causing her to make reckless decisions. Her spirit, Willow, is lost in the throes of addiction, and her heart just isn't in it. Xander isn't really invested in his upcoming wedding. He's having second thoughts about marrying Anya, and eventually commits the ultimate betrayal of love and leaves her at the altar, breaking Anya's heart. This is the Scooby Gang at their worst, and it contributes to Buffy's downfall. On the surface, we see a girl suffering from clinical depression, and her friends being so wrapped up in their own problems that they fail to notice or aren't able to help her. But metaphorically, Buffy's heart, mind, and spirit are not functioning the way they're supposed to, and that is part of the reason why she spirals so badly. And the other reason is, of course, her resurrection. The arc gets kicked off in the beginning with Buffy being resurrected from the dead, and us as the audience are made to experience, as with most things, the horror of Buffy's return from Buffy's perspective. We feel her pain as she's brought into the middle of a war zone, disoriented and confused. And this is even before we learn the truth about where Buffy was. Coincidentally enough, watching Buffy move through the world in a daze, being frightened by all the sudden noises and chaos, reminds me a lot of what sensory overload feels like for me. Willow had good intentions in bringing her back, but yanking her out of heaven or wherever she was and putting her back on Earth was ultimately selfish. And as Buffy herself puts it, everything here is cold and hard and violent. It seems only natural that she would slip into a mind-numbing depression. Now, in my mind, season 5 is essentially about saving Dawn from glory, and as a result, saving her humanity and her innocence from her Slayer side, or a version of the Slayer power unchecked. The gift was originally supposed to be the series finale, and I can see why. The show is supposed to be a metaphor for an adolescent growing into adulthood, and the Slayer power is a metaphor for adulthood, with the monsters she faces being metaphors for the trials of being a teenager. The season finale for season 5 is supposed to be the end of that process. She's told she needs to kill Dawn, thereby killing her inner child and her innocence in order to save the world and fully embrace her Slayer role and adulthood. So when she jumps, she saves one side of herself from the other. It's an almost romanticized suicide, seen as a sacrifice rather than killing herself. But while Buffy did die to save Dawn, on a metaphorical level, she essentially kills herself in an attempt to save her inner child from adulthood, from having to grow up. And in season 6, she is forced back into that adult role, and forced to live as an adult, paying bills, worrying about money, searching for a job, and having to work a crap minimum wage job. And with the crushing burden of adulthood, then comes depression. Buffy's storyline resembles traditional clinical depression quite closely, and how she is clearly trying to stick it out in the beginning and put on a good face for the sake of her friends and Dawn, because she doesn't want to hurt them. I think she recognizes what losing her did to them, especially Dawn, and she wants to live for them, but it's killing her emotionally and mentally. She finds herself seeking out Spike more and more after episode 3 Afterlife and onwards, because she isn't concerned with his opinion. And she knows, I believe, deep down, that no matter what she says or does, he will always love her, no matter what. And that kind of unconditional love can be very intoxicating. Spike has no grounds to judge her, and he just simply wouldn't, being a soulless vampire. As she describes to him in episode 4, Flooded, "I feel like I'm spending all my time trying to be okay so they don't worry. It's exhausting." When you're dealing with depression, sometimes the worst part can be the judgment from other people, and the stress you develop over trying to seem like you're not losing it gets added onto the crazy you already feel, and it makes it even worse. If we had a different society, a society where mental health wasn't so stigmatized, and we could actually talk about these things, then maybe the situation will be different. But the shame in most cases is what kills you. Buffy gets driven into a position where she's just expected, in a sense, to get over what she's dealing with and get back to normal and move on with her life. Not just because her friends are worried about her, but because it's making them uncomfortable. And I get that. Nobody wants to be around a depressed person, believe me, I know. Especially when you're happy. So as a result, either people start avoiding you or you start avoiding them. Because you're so afraid of making them uncomfortable and dragging the mood down. Also, not to mention, it's hard to be around happy people who are having fun when you're just so filled with apathy. So Buffy ends up alone, or with Spike, which is essentially the same thing. Now, Spike is one of Buffy's many shadow selves. The others being Cordelia, Faith, Dawn, and Glory. In the early seasons, Cordelia represents her path not taken, essentially. She is the popular head cheerleader who is bold and forthright, always speaking her mind, admittedly being also quite harsh and vain at times. Cordelia represents the girl Buffy was before she became the Slayer, and probably who she still would be if she hadn't been called. Xander acts out his crush on Buffy through being interested in Cordy, and eventually dating her. But as Cordelia grows and changes and eventually leaves to go on to Angel and embark on an entirely different arc, Xander begins to lose interest in her because she stopped being Buffy's shadow self. This is around the same time Faith enters the picture and becomes Buffy's next shadow self. While Cordelia, in a sense, did represent Buffy's id and her selfish desires, it is even more obvious with Faith. Faith is a character that is very sexual and violent in nature, in some ways due to her past, but also because she represents Buffy's darker impulses. She conflates sex and death in the same way Spike does, which is very interesting. When you think about how they both represent the same role and Spike takes it over after Faith. It also makes sense that in both cases these characters would have a very sexually charged relationship with Buffy and would be having very sexually charged confrontations with her. Faith flirts with Buffy while she fights. You know, like, let's have another go at it, see who lands on top. Give us a kiss, there's my girl. And Spike does the same thing, and eventually makes his intentions more concrete when confessing his love for Buffy, and then promptly chaining her to the wall and threatening her life. Spike is a character that not only conflates sex and violence and death, but also love, as shown quite concretely in the episode Fool for Love, which is a masterpiece of an episode. Buffy and Spike end up finally having sex after beating each other to bloody pulps, which can be seen as an act of Buffy giving in to her darker desires and giving in to her id, which is represented by Spike. I do wish this type of relationship could have been explored with Faith as well, but of course it was the late 90s. Due to censorship and queerphobic attitudes, it just wasn't happening. I was robbed, we were all robbed. But moving on. Something fascinating about Spike is the fact that he feels the most like a reflection of Buffy out of all of her shadow selves. He is the most connected to her, arguably. There is mirror imagery present from the very first scene where he is introduced. In School Hard, he is cut on the left cheek by Drusilla, creating a line of blood, which she then licks up. And at the school the next day, Buffy is shown painting with a smudge of red paint on the exact same cheek. The same mirror imagery tactic is employed several more times by the show, dressing Buffy and Spike alike in similar dark colors and long trench coats in various episodes like Becoming Part 2, Fool for Love, Once More with Feeling, Tabula Rasa, Dead Things, and many, many more. In Afterlife, Buffy's knuckles are bloodied from clawing her way out of her own grave. And Spike mentions to her that he had to do the exact same thing when he was reborn, drawing another link between the two of them. Later on in this episode, Spike is shown punching a wall in his crypt, which then gives him bloody knuckles. When Buffy seeks Spike out, she notices and comments on it.
Your hand is hurt.
Same to you.
Right.
Spike is a part of Buffy, a part that she occasionally despises and rejects, but one that she finds herself in need of often, especially during her darkest moments. She tells him she can be alone with him because essentially being with him is just the same thing as being with herself. The series actually references this a few times, the first being in Becoming Part 2.
I'm all you've got.
One of the most compelling things about Buffy Season 6 is how accurately it portrays not only moments of despair and suicidal anguish, but also the dreary day-to-day soul-sucking activity of moving through everyday life when you have depression. This is shown the most in Flooded and Life serial, but honestly, it's shown pretty consistently throughout the entire season. Speaking from personal experience, trying to go back to school, deal with money problems, and get a job when you're busy trying to convince yourself to get out of bed is beyond exhausting. But so is being around your friends who expect you to just be happy. And honestly, just existing is hard. As Buffy puts it, you have no idea how hard it is just being here. My brain still flashes back to little key moments that really stood out to me throughout the season that show how lethargic she's feeling. Like in Flooded, when the pipe bursts the first time, and she just stands there and closes her eyes. Another moment is in What's More with Feeling, golden episode, when Buffy's alarm clock goes off and she just holds it and stares at it for a long time. It's little instances like this that make the depression feel grounded in reality, and less like stereotypical movie depression where the main character is sitting in a dark room with smudged mascara staring dramatically out the window. When Buffy stares at the running water in the sink, letting it waste and Flooded, or in Tabula Rasa when she gets her memories back and she just stays on the ground in shock, we feel her weight and her agony. I love watching those scenes and the season as a whole, but it's an experience that often drains me of my energy and makes me more aware of my own depression. It's definitely an experience you need to be in a certain headspace for. And that may be why there are certain people who just really don't like this season. And I understand that, because happy people don't like to be dragged into the dark with us. When I rewatch season 6, I often do it when I'm already at my lowest, when I am already in the midst of my depressive episode. It feels comforting and familiar, like sitting in silence with an old friend and just breathing. But season 6 of Buffy isn't all bleak. There are also moments of hope that make me both cry and give me strength. A particular moment that stands out to me is at the end of another episode the majority of the fandom wrote off, Gone. I actually have no idea why so many people seem not to enjoy this episode, or at least not find it memorable. This episode explores something that I personally find so relatable, and that is just the urge to disappear from your life when you're depressed. Not necessarily through ending your life and leaving this world, but just through escaping reality. This is something that I, as an autistic person who suffers from depression and social anxiety disorder, constantly experiences. I often engage in something called maladaptive daydreaming, which Wikipedia defines as when an individual experiences excessive daydreaming that interferes with daily life. It is a proposed diagnosis of a disordered form of dissociative absorption associated with excessive fantasy that is not recognized by any major medical or psychological criteria. It is not associated with any specific disorder, but I found that it appears to be quite common with people with autism and/or ADHD. It is also quite often associated with trauma because people are usually using it as a coping mechanism. It's actually something that I've been doing ever since I was a child. Sometimes I lose hours or even whole days to my daydreams, but it stems from that desire to escape your life, to be free. When Buffy is turned invisible by the trio, the metaphorical eye is off of her, so she doesn't feel the need to be performing or putting on any sort of facade. She doesn't have to answer to anyone, and I think it's that freedom that empowers her to go and seek out Spike. After the previous episode, Buffy was pretty adamant about never sleeping with him again. She even put garlic all around her room and her windowsill to keep him out. Which, minor side note here, does that even work on the vampires in this show? Because I don't really remember that ever being included in the lore, but I might be just misremembering that. Anyways, she seems pretty happy and casual about being at Spike's and being with Spike. So much so that when Xander comes looking for her, she uses her invisibility to her advantage and she messes with them both. But Spike knows that she's just being avoidant and trying to escape her problems. And in a rare instance of him asserting boundaries with her, he kicks her out. Something that surprises her as well. A lot of people seem confused and concerned by why Buffy seems so cavalier about being invisible, like Xander and Dawn. But Spike understands, as he often does. And when Buffy gets that call, the call that tells her that she's fading away, it forces her to come back to herself and to her life. She's essentially presented with two clear choices. Let herself die or fight. It's the same choice she was presented with in Bargaining Part 2, only this time instead of choosing to live for someone else, for Dawn, as Dawn was the one who asked Buffy to, she chooses to fight for herself. And during Buffy's conversation with Willow at the end of the episode, we see why.
When I got Xander's message, that I was fading away, I actually got scared.
Yeah, who wouldn't?
Me. I wouldn't. Not too long ago, I probably would have welcomed it. But I realized I'm not saying that I'm doing backflips about my life, but I don't want to die. That's something, right?
That scene genuinely makes me cry every time I watch it for multiple reasons. Because I'm proud of her, because it's an emotional scene, but also mostly just because I can relate. Getting to that particular point in your recovery from suicidal ideation is incredibly important. Sometimes it's about the small victories, and not wanting to die can be one of them. The thing that the season and the show in general also understands is that recovery isn't always linear. Buffy doesn't travel upwards in one straight line. Sometimes she backslides. Sometimes she wavers. It is the nature of healing. Buffy's still separated and isolated from her friends and dead things. She, as Spike puts it, tries to be with them, but she always ends up back in the dark with him. However, he purposefully misinterprets what this means to serve his own interests. Spike is the master of twisting the truth just enough to service his own needs. Also, I do believe that there is a part of him that believes what he's saying here, that Buffy is drawn to the darkness and also inherently to him. And if Spike is Buffy's shadow self, a reflection of Buffy's darker desires, then what he really means is that Buffy is being pulled towards those desires. So then, of course, the question remains, is he correct? Well, yes and no. I am honestly not a fan of posing the question, are Buffy and Spike good or right for each other? I find it much more productive and interesting to examine what their relationship to each other highlights about both these characters, and the elements that they bring out of one another. And sometimes those elements can be ugly as hell. I'm also not a fan of the way sometimes certain people in the fandom act like everything Spike says about Buffy is always inherently right and true, because I don't think that's necessarily a very truthful interpretation of the text. But everyone's entitled to their own opinion, whatever. When Buffy thinks she killed Katrina, she sinks even further into her self-loathing and depression. She already believes she's wrong, or that there's something horribly wrong with her, because Spike can hit her, and because she's been sleeping with him, although she doesn't tell Tara that part originally. Also, I think partially because of the way she's been feeling as a whole. She fears she's changed somehow. She believes it so much that she actually asks Tara to check and see if she was brought back wrong. If anyone tried to trick Buffy into thinking she killed someone any other time when she wasn't already dealing with a deep depression and self-hatred, odds are it wouldn't have worked, or it wouldn't have affected her this deeply. The trio's illusion fools her, I believe, mainly because it plays into what she already feels about herself. That she is dark and possibly inherently evil, and that is the reason for all of these feelings she doesn't understand. And the reason for being drawn to Spike. And it's those buttons that Spike continues to push throughout the season by feeding into her fears. Now, interestingly enough, this is where those themes of anti-romanticism that I mentioned earlier come back into play. Only now, Buffy is playing a different role. The opposite role. Most likely due to the fact that she was irrevocably shaped and changed by her relationship with Angel and all the trauma that came with it. She has a very distrustful approach to love and relationships now, and has become in some ways closed off. While that is a trauma response and something that I think she can and should work to overcome, I despise the men in her life trying to force her to do it on their own terms and assuming that they know what she needs. As I mentioned earlier, Spike may be incredibly perceptive at times. It may in some ways seem like he understands her and knows her better than she understands herself. But Spike always distorts everything through his own soulless perspective. And with the perspective of not only being in love with Buffy, but as he puts it, being love's bitch. Spike is now in the position that Buffy was in during season 2 with Angel. Only unlike Buffy, he cannot claim a greater identity than being hers. He is her shadow because it's what the themes and the narrative demand. But if we think of Spike as real, he is something, not even a man, that is so utterly obsessed with Buffy that he sees no purpose for his life beyond loving her and belonging to her. He is completely at the mercy of romanticism. When Buffy tries to turn herself into the cops for Katrina's murder, Spike tries to stop her. He tries to state reasons that she shouldn't have to take responsibility for this because it wasn't her fault. It was an accident. He brings up the same utilitarian argument that Faith actually used in Consequences, once again linking them. It is very interesting how the presence of Faith can be felt throughout this entire season, especially within Buffy and Spike's relationship. Again, we were robbed. This is probably mainly because Faith and Spike were essentially structured to be the same character, or at least serve the same narrative purpose in the show. But all of Spike's excuses ultimately stem from the same selfish place, that he can't bear to let her go because he loves her. He loves her selfishly, the only way he can, because he doesn't have a soul. Also, as Buffy points out, he can't understand what she's going through. All the guilt she's experiencing because he doesn't have a soul. And in all her guilt and agony and self-hatred, she snaps. She takes her anger out on Spike the same way she's done before, because Spike is an easy target, and she believes he deserves it. Maybe in some ways he kind of does. But also, she wants to punish herself, because the person she's really angry at, the person she really hates, is her.
You don't have a soul. There is nothing good or clean in you. You are dead inside. You can't feel anything real.
Spike represents her darker desires, the piece of herself she blames everything for. So she beats him bloody, but she really wants to attack herself. So everything that she yells at Spike, I think, can actually be read as what she feels towards herself. It kind of reminds me of, once again bringing up Faith, that scene in the end of season 4 where Buffy and Faith have switched bodies, and Faith in Buffy's body sees her own reflection, her body, and she just attacks. She starts beating her bloody, essentially punching Buffy, but she's really punching her own body. She's punching herself because she's really angry at herself, and she starts just screaming at her. I think those scenes are definitely meant to parallel each other. Buffy is just so convinced that she's evil at this point, like a demon in some way. Soulless, just like the vampires she kills, just like Spike. And then when Tara tells her that there's nothing wrong with her, and she didn't come back wrong, it's the final straw. When you're so depressed and traumatized that you can feel everything you used to feel and everything you once held dear slipping away from you, there's this urge to blame something or pinpoint an exact moment where everything went wrong so you can figure out what to do to fix it. But sometimes it's not that simple. And when you start to screw up and do crazy things, things you never would have thought you had been capable of, you want to think of yourself as a different person. A version of yourself that's less real than the real you, because the real you would never do the things you're doing. But the truth is, this is you. You who is a human being and makes mistakes. You who is in pain. The truth is, I think Buffy has been heading to this point for a while now. She has a lot of unaddressed trauma in her life, both from being the Slayer and also just from being a person. Buffy is never really given the opportunity to fully deal with things or grieve, or just sit with her emotions, because she always has to keep moving, because she has a job to do. She has to keep the world safe, and she has people to look after. And honestly, her friends are historically not great at understanding her trauma. There are multiple instances of her friends ambushing her about the things she's done that they don't like, and criticizing her for being secretive and not telling them things. But the issue is, the reason she doesn't confide in them is because she knows they won't react well, and she knows they won't be able to fully understand. In my video on autism and queerness and how they intersect, I talked briefly about how Buffy can be used as a metaphor for queerness as well as being autistic, in my opinion. Just to recap, BTVS is about a girl who is inherently different from everyone and set apart from her peers. She has this thing about her that makes her different, makes her special. She's a vampire slayer, and that prevents her from fully fitting in and engaging in supposedly mainstream activities alongside her peers. Even her friends who actually know her secret don't fully understand her or who she is. They don't get it because they're not the Slayer. So many of Buffy's arcs and internal conflicts are about feeling separate and distant from everyone else and struggling to relate to other people. And when she breaks down on Tara's lap, I think it is very much from a build-up of all of the trauma she's been dealing with all of these past years, as well as her coming to grips with her own self-hatred and finally just airing it all out in the open to someone who she knows won't judge her or try and scold her. Tara isn't Willow or Xander or Giles. She's just Tara. Quiet, sweet, compassionate, wise, and understanding Tara. She gives Buffy what she needs. She listens and gives her someone to cry on. And also, I think there is that added layer of her not knowing Buffy quite as well as the other three. So she feels less pressure. In some ways, it can be easier to vent to someone you don't know very well versus venting to your best friend or someone you are very, very close with and love very deeply, because there's less pressure surrounding your fear of their reaction or what they're going to say or if they're going to judge you or see you differently. We had to get here at some point. The themes of consent and sexual assault in this season are very interesting when we parallel Warren's behavior with Katrina to Spike and Buffy. The way Warren reaches out to Katrina with this desperation turned violent immediately becomes familiar when you see it again with Buffy and Spike and Dead Things. We see Buffy and Katrina both beg Spike and Warren to let them go. Katrina when she's trying to escape from the trio, and Buffy when she's trying to turn herself in for Katrina's murder. And then both Spike and Warren use the exact same excuse: I can't, I love you. This was definitely intentional on the writer's part in order to set up the conflict in Seeing Red. I hate calling it conflict, but I'm trying to analyze this from a critic's perspective. However, many times during this essay, I have mentioned my own personal feelings and opinions because I believe it can be useful to analyze media with your emotions as well. It can be very difficult to remain impartial regarding certain events in this series, particularly in this season, and Spike's attempted assault of Buffy is just one of those things. So let's finally address the elephant in the room. When a lot of people in this fandom talk about this scene, they call it out of character, or say things like, oh, Spike would never. And while I understand the desire to defend a character you love, this is a pretty terrible take. Because Spike is introduced from the very beginning as a character that regularly conflates sex, love, violence, and death. And yes, this is something that most vampires do, but Spike seems to do it like the most, or perhaps puts the most emphasis on it, because he is the vampire who is one of Buffy's shadow selves. Fool for Love in particular is just dripping with examples of this, from Spike's sexualization of Nikki, referring to fighting as the dance, and then comparing death to orgasm in one of my favorite Spike lines of all time.
The thing about the dance is, you never get to stop. Every day you wake up, it's the same bloody question what haunts you. Is today the day I die? Death is on your heels, baby. And sooner or later, it's gonna catch you. Part of you wants it. Not only to stop the fear and uncertainty, but because you're just a little bit in love with it. Death is your art. You make it with your hands, day after day. That final gasp, that look of peace. Part of you is desperate to know, what's it like? Where does it lead you?
And now you see, that's the secret. Not the punch she didn't throw, or the kick she didn't land. She merely wanted it. Every Slayer has a death wish. Even you.
The only reason you've lasted as long as you have is you've got ties to the world.
Mum, brat kid sister, Scoobies.
They don't tie you here, but you're just putting off the inevitable. Sooner or later, you're gonna want it. And the second that happens, you know I'll be there. I'll slip in. Have myself a real good day.
I could probably go on for days about how much I love all the Spike monologues. They're just delivered so perfectly, but I'm gonna stop myself now. And then you have the fact that Spike literally chained Buffy to a wall in Crush to confess his love to her. As much as you might hate to admit it, I think we can all agree we've been kind of heading here with Spike and Buffy for a while now. I do see how this kind of seems like the writers are trying to throw everything they can at Buffy this season to put her at her absolute lowest. And I do think the way they handled it going forward in season 7 was not great. However, I can't in good conscience say that it makes no sense or that it was out of character. From a metaphorical standpoint, it's interesting because You can read it as Buffy's shadow, the representation of her id or repressed sexual desires, literally attacking her for ignoring them. But that can get a bit messy if you analyze what that's supposed to mean. Does that mean it's Buffy's fault? Is that what the text is trying to say? I don't think so. The way I see all of this is Spike cannot exist as Buffy's shadow self long term. The same way none of her shadow selves can exist as just shadows of Buffy forever. She takes what she needs from them and integrates it into herself. See Faith's line in season 3, episode 22, take what you need. And then she moves on and they become their own fully fledged people. See Faith, Cordelia, etc. And I believe this is part of the process that Spike went through when getting his soul back. Realistically, I know this decision was made because the writers, Joss in particular, didn't like that the fans were so attached to Spike, so they need to have him do something unforgivable to prove that vampires need a soul to be good, which is annoying, to say the least. But I still do think that Spike's transformation is interesting, if you look at him as Buffy's shadow self. I also think, regardless of how the attempted assault was handled, what he says to Buffy first is an excellent example of how Spike is playing out Buffy's role of someone who is a slave to romanticism that she was filling in season 2 with Angel, as I mentioned earlier. And this time, Buffy responds as someone who has had the experience of romanticism blowing up in her face. She has distanced herself from Spike because she recognizes that this pattern she's stuck on isn't good for her. And when he comes to her in the bathroom telling her that real love burns and consumes, she responds with, until there's nothing left. I believe she's been intrinsically shaped by her trauma over what happened with Angel losing his soul. And I definitely think it's been influencing how she acts around Spike and how she approaches the subject of his love throughout the season. Actually, not just throughout this season, but throughout all of season 5 as well. And I'm not saying that excuses any of the things Spike has said or done to her out of frustration at how she occasionally treats him. Absolutely not. But it does make sense. That and the fact that she is repressing the desires she's so ashamed of. It makes sense that even if she does feel something for Spike at this point, maybe not even love, but just something, like a connection of some sort, she would never admit it. Because at this point, she's not only on edge from the Angelus experience, but she's also been left by Riley. You could even throw Faith into the mix and argue that her betrayal influenced Buffy's feelings towards love, relationships, and human connection. She's been hurt and left and betrayed so many times now. Not just by her love interests, but by her father and by Giles, her father figure as well. She's become pretty pessimistic and jaded towards human connection at this point. Something that has been brought up before in season 5 and is explored later in season 7 as well. But I don't believe that it's just being the Slayer that's making her cold or less in touch with humanity. I think the trauma she's been through is shutting her down bit by bit. From my personal experience, it's easy to feel like you are losing pieces of your soul each time you're abandoned or betrayed. Like each time you have your heart broken against your will, you become colder and more twisted until one day you're unrecognizable. And you start to feel like it's your own fault that this keeps happening, like you're broken in some way. I think this is something that Buffy's been dealing with for a while now, but it comes to a head in season 6. Her depression mixes with her trauma, which is a pretty common experience, and it morphs into this paralyzing grief, almost as if you're grieving yourself. And in Buffy's case, this season she technically is. She starts the season having her supposedly heroic moment ripped from her as Willow undoes her sacrifice and brings her back to life. As I mentioned earlier, her leap from the tower feels very much like suicide, and yes, she was saving everyone, but I also believe that there was a part of her that just wanted it all to end. Everything that she's been going through for the past 5 years has been taking its toll on her, significantly. And we see this in countless ways. Yes, her friends and family provide a support system that the other Slayers didn't have, but they cannot provide her with everything she needs. Partly because they're not the Slayer and they don't understand everything she deals with, but also partly because, simply put, they're not therapists. And no one can really blame them for that. And then it all just sort of comes crashing down in season 6 when Buffy's depression and suicidality is at its absolute worst. But as the season progresses and time goes on, we see her moving forward and reconciling with her friends and Dawn, and talking about some of the things that have been bothering her. Not nearly enough, in my opinion, but it's a start. She's trying to put the pieces back together and heal from everything she's been through. With Angel, with Spike, with being the Slayer, just with everything. One of my favorite YouTube videos on Buffy Season 6 of all time is I Wish I Could and Don't Hate Buffy Season 6 by 5x5 Takes. There's the quote from that video that I think sums up Season 6 perfectly. Healing isn't always inspirational or poetic. Sometimes it's just forward. It's true. And it's something that I've definitely experienced in my own life as well. So Buffy moves forward, and as a result, so does the show. Her show. And as the events of Grave finally come to a close, and it's revealed that they're all going to be okay, Buffy weeps with relief. As the episode comes to a close, we see the aftermath of Willow's chaos. Anya pulling an injured Giles out of the completely brutalized magic box, Willow sobbing in Xander's arms as he comforts her, and Buffy and Dawn climbing out of the giant hole they fell into. It almost gives you the feeling of examining the wreckage after a storm. Almost if Season 6 was like a hurricane that blew through these characters' lives, and now they're left to pick up the pieces and move forward. But honestly, that's a pretty accurate depiction of how life can be sometimes. I believe the essential point of Season 6 is to show these characters to us at their absolute worst, to break them down and then build them back up again, and to ask the viewers for forgiveness and compassion. Because as Tara says in Entropy, things fall apart. They fall apart so hard. And if we can see these characters we love fall apart and build themselves back up again and still cherish and sympathize with them through it all, then maybe we can do the same for each other. Maybe we can even do it for ourselves.
When we die, we go in